The Frozen Coffin, the true story of the 1913 Karluk expedition and the worst Arctic disaster in history. There is a kind of cold that does not merely touch the skin, but seems to remember you, to seek you out. It is a cold with a voice, a low and constant hum that vibrates in the bones long after the fingers have gone white and the thoughts have begun to slow. The Arctic has always been less a place and more an idea, a vast, breathing contradiction of crushing, sterile beauty and unimaginable, patient violence. For centuries, it was the ultimate riddle, a frozen sphinx at the top of the world that devoured the arrogant and the unprepared, sparing only those who approached it with a humility so profound it bordered on fear. By the early years of the 20th century, the great age of Arctic exploration was already a cemetery of ambitions. The names read like a litany of tragedy. Franklin, whose 2 ships and 129 men vanished into the white silence. Their bones later found scattered across the tundra, some scored with the marks of cannibalism. DeLong, whose Jeanette was chewed to splinters by the pack ice, leaving her crew to drag boats across 1,000 miles of frozen sea, only to starve or drown within sight of the Siberian coast. And then there was André, who attempted to reach the North Pole by hydrogen balloon, only to have his dream crash onto the ice, his party surviving for 3 months before succumbing to polar bears, exposure, and the slow, indifferent decay of the Arctic winter. Yet the pull remained. For every man who died, 2 more stepped forward to take his place. The North Pole was the last great terrestrial prize, a nail on the globe that no human foot had yet touched. And in 1913, one man believed he had the plan, the ship, and the grit to take it. His name was Vilhjálmur Stefansson, and he was perhaps the most complex, brilliant, and catastrophically flawed figure in the history of polar exploration. This is not a story of heroism in the traditional sense. There are no clean uniforms, no triumphant flag plantings, no rousing speeches before a final, successful charge. This is the story of the Karluk. It is the story of what happens when hubris meets the unforgiving logic of the ice. It is a story of starvation, madness, murder, and a slow, grinding death that lasted for nearly 2 years. It is the worst Arctic disaster in history, not merely because of the numbers, though 11 souls lost out of 25 is a butcher's bill, but because of the way they died. It is a story that begins with a lie and ends with a miracle, and between those 2 points lies a hell of ice. The dreamer and his ark. Vilhjálmur Stefansson was a man carved from the very landscape he sought to conquer. Tall, lean, with a high forehead and piercing eyes that seemed to hold a perpetual calculating light. He was not a sailor, nor was he a hardened dog sledger. He was an anthropologist and an ethnographer, a man who had lived among the Inuit of the Mackenzie Delta and learned their ways. He had thrived on caribou meat and raw fish, slept in snow houses, and mastered the art of dressing in caribou skins to trap body heat. He returned from his earlier expeditions, not just alive, but boastful. He claimed to have discovered the friendly Arctic, a region he argued was not a barren wasteland, but a generous pantry full of seals, polar bears, and fish for those who knew how to hunt it. This was a seductive and largely fictional narrative. The Arctic is not friendly. It is the most hostile environment on Earth. But the public and the geographical societies did not want to hear about frozen death. They wanted to hear about possibility. Stephenson convinced the American Museum of Natural History and the National Geographic Society to fund a massive new expedition. The goal was audacious. To find a lost continent north of Alaska, he called it Crocker Land, to map the Beaufort Sea, and to claim the North Pole for the United States and Canada. To do this, he needed a ship. He found one, but it was a ship with a secret. The Carluck was a former whaling bark, built in 1884 in Dundee, Scotland. She was stout, as whalers were, designed to withstand the rough push of the northern Atlantic. But by 1913, she was nearly 30 years old. Her hull, though reinforced with ironwood and greenheart, had been worked hard. She'd been crushed in the ice once before, in 1901, and patched up. Stephenson, ever the optimist, either ignored or actively concealed the vessel's frailties. He needed a ship immediately, and the Carluck was available. He bought her for $10,000, christened her the flagship of his Canadian Arctic expedition, and loaded her to the gunwales with supplies, scientists, sailors, and a bitter simmering hierarchy of command. The crew was a powder keg of egos and incompetence. The captain of the Carluck was a man named Robert Bartlett. If Stephenson was the dreamer, Bartlett was the realist. A giant of a man, born in Newfoundland, Bartlett had grown up in the ice. He had sailed with Admiral Peary, had stood a few hundred yards from the North Pole itself. He knew the pack ice like a farmer knows his fields. He knew when it was safe to push forward and when it was suicide. Bartlett had a thick Newfoundland accent, hands like shovels, and a low tolerance for fools. He looked at the Carluck with a sailor's eye and saw rot. He warned Stephenson that the ship was not fit for a heavy ice grind. Stephenson smiled his charismatic smile and overruled him. The expedition was too important. The weather window was too tight. They would sail north. The rest of the company was a cross-section of early 20th century ambition. There was a young, earnest geologist named Alistair Forbes Mackay, a veteran of Shackleton's expedition who had once walked to the South Magnetic Pole. There was a quiet, capable Icelandic carpenter and naturalist, Bjarni Mar Stephenson, no relation to Vilhjálmur. There was a gangling, enthusiastic biologist named Kenneth Killer Martin. There was a taciturn Scottish seaman named Sandy Anderson. And there were the Inuit, a family of hunters and seamstresses who were the expedition's only hope for survival, though Stephenson treated them as an afterthought. There was Kuraluk, his wife, Kururuk, and their 2 children, 5-year-old Pogni and 3-year-old Helen. There was the patriarch, old Mamiauk, and a young sharp hunter named Kataktovik. They sailed from Victoria, British Columbia in June 1913. It was a glorious departure. Flags flew, reporters scribbled notes. Stephenson stood on the deck looking like a Viking chieftain. Inside the cabins, the scientists sorted their instruments, barometers, theodolites, specimen jars. Nobody looked too closely at the soft planks in the bow. Nobody asked why the pumps ran a little too often. The voyage north was a slow-motion disaster. The Carluck chugged up the Alaskan coast, through the Bering Strait, and into the Chukchi Sea. Almost immediately, the ice appeared. Not the loose, burgy bits of the lower latitudes, but the pack. A vast, undulating plain of frozen seawater that stretched from the horizon to the bow, shifting and growing with the pressure of wind and current. Stephenson was impatient. He had charted a course far to the northwest, toward Wrangel Island and the supposed location of Crocker Land. To do this, he had to push the Karluk deep into the ice. Bartlett protested. He wanted to hug the coast, to stay in the leads of open water that formed close to land. But Stephenson was the expedition leader. He was not a sailor, but he was the boss. "The ship is sound," he said, or words to that effect. "The ice is light this year. We must push on." The Karluk groaned into the pack. For a few days it seemed to work. The ship would nose into a lead, push a few miles, and then stop, waiting for the wind to shift and open another lane. But the ice was not light. It was heavy, multi-year ice, blue and hard as granite. It began to press against the Karluk's sides. The crew could hear it, a high-pitched squeal at first, then a deep, resonant creak, like the groan of a cathedral under a heavy wind. By mid-August, the Karluk was stuck, not just drifting, but truly beset. The ice had closed around her like a fist, and she was no longer a ship, but a prisoner. Bartlett ordered the engines stopped. There was no point. The propellers were frozen in place. The Karluk was now a passive participant in her own death, a wooden cork in a frozen river that was beginning to move. The drift began. The prevailing ocean currents in the Chukchi Sea flow in a slow westerly arc, pushing ice towards the Siberian coast. The Karluk, locked in the pack, began to drift backward, away from the pole, away from Crocker Land, toward the open sea, and beyond it, oblivion. Stephenson watched the drift calculations with growing alarm. This was not the plan. He was supposed to be advancing, not retreating. Then on a gray day in early September, Stephenson made the decision that would damn him forever. He announced that he was leaving the ship. He claimed he was going to hunt for caribou to supplement the fresh meat supply for the crew. He gathered a small party, 5 men, including a photographer and an ornithologist, and stepped off the Karluk onto the ice. They took a couple of sleds, some dogs, and light supplies. Bartlett watched him go. He knew. He knew it instantly. Stephenson was not just hunting. He was abandoning the ship. The ice was moving faster now, and the open water leads were freezing solid. Once Stephenson walked out of sight behind a pressure ridge, he would not be able to find his way back to the Karluk, even if he wanted to. And the look on his face as he left, that tight, controlled expression of a man who has decided to save himself, told Bartlett everything. Stephenson never returned. He and his party found the ice shifting, and they made for solid land, the Alaskan coast. They walked for days, eventually reaching safety at Point Barrow. From there, Stephenson sent a telegram to Ottawa. It was a masterpiece of spin. "Expedition progressing well," he wrote. "Ship directed to proceed north. I'm going to Crocker Land by trail." He did not mention that the Karluk was frozen solid, that her captain had no way to steer her, that a quarter of his crew was now a drifting speck in the Arctic Ocean. He left them to die. On board the Karluk, the silence after Stephenson's departure was heavier than any storm. The scientists looked at each other. The sailors cursed under their breath. They were trapped. No radio. No rescue coming. Just the ice. The endless twilight of the approaching Arctic winter and the slow, certain knowledge that they were now the responsibility of Captain Bob Bartlett. The autumn of 1913 was a lesson in dread. The sun began to circle lower and lower in the sky, finally disappearing entirely on November 18th. For the next 90 days they would live in darkness or a perpetual gloomy twilight. Life aboard the Karluk settled into a grim routine. Bartlett kept the crew busy. He had them build snow walls around the ship to insulate the hull against the cold. He organized hunting parties to shoot seals or polar bears on the ice. He had the carpenter Bjarni shore up the bulkheads. But everyone knew it was a holding action. The ice was not static. It was a living, grinding thing. The pressure ridges, huge walls of shattered ice blocks, some as tall as a house, were building up around them. At night, the ship would shudder violently as the pack squeezed. Timbers groaned, nails popped. A sound like gunfire echoed through the holds as planks splintered under the strain. The cold was a character in itself. It was not the cold of a Canadian winter or a Minnesota blizzard. It was a cold that had no bottom. Minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit was a warm day. Minus 60 was common. Breathing through your mouth froze the moisture in your lungs, causing a dry hacking cough. Breathing through your nose froze your nostrils shut. Metal became a weapon. Touch a door handle with your bare skin, and you left a layer of flesh behind. The kerosene for the stoves turned to a thick, waxy jelly. Sextants and thermometers froze and shattered. Morale began to fray. The expedition had been structured with a rigid class system. The scientists, the geologists, the biologists had cabins near the stern. They had books, private stores of chocolate and tobacco. The sailors and the Inuit lived in the forecastle, a damp, dark, cramped space near the bow. The Inuit in particular were treated as servants. They were given the worst food, the worst bunks, the least respect. This division would fester into something much uglier as the weeks turned into months. The first serious blow came in late November. A massive pressure ridge began to build directly against the port side of the Karluk. The ship listed heavily, tilting 20 degrees to one side. Dishes slid off tables. Beds became slides. The carpenter reported water in the forward hold. The ice had pierced the hull. Bartlett ordered all hands to the pumps. They pumped for 36 hours straight, a brutal, exhausting relay. Men would collapse at the pump handles, only to be dragged away and replaced by another shivering, half-frozen soul. They managed to keep the Karluk afloat just barely, but the ship was mortally wounded. She was now a floating, sinking wreck, held together only by the ice that was crushing her. The second blow was psychological. In early December, a young sailor named Stanley Morris began to act strangely. He was a quiet boy from Wales, prone to melancholy. The endless dark, the cold, the noise of the groaning ice, it broke something in him. He stopped eating. He would stand on the deck for hours, staring into the blackness. One night he walked out onto the ice without his coat. A hunting party found him hours later, curled into a fetal position, his lips blue, his eyes wide open and staring at nothing. He was not dead, but his mind was gone. He had to be tied to his bunk to keep him from walking out again. He would never fully recover. He was the first casualty of the Arctic madness, but he would not be the last. January 1914, the worst month. The temperature dropped to minus 65 degrees. The kerosene froze solid. The cook had to chop it with an axe to burn it in the stoves. The food was running low. The hunting parties had sporadic luck. A skinny seal here, a desperate polar bear there, but the game was scarce. The animals had migrated south or were buried under the snow. Men began to lose weight. Their cheeks hollowed. Their eyes took on a glassy, distant look. Bartlett made a decision. He called a meeting in the main cabin. The oil lamps flickered, casting long, dancing shadows on the frost-covered beams. He told them the truth. The Karluk was dying. The leak in the forward hold was getting worse. He estimated they had weeks, maybe days before the ship went down. They had to prepare to abandon ship. They had to build a camp on the ice, a permanent camp, and wait for the spring thaw, hoping to drift close enough to land to make a run for it. The announcement was met with silence, then panic, then a grim, quiet resolve. The scientists began to argue about what to save. The geologist wanted to save his rock samples. The biologist wanted to save his jars of pickled fish. Bartlett cut them off. "We save food, tents, ammunition, and fur clothing," he said. "Everything else stays. This is not a museum. This is a fight for our lives." On the morning of January 11th, the end came. The pressure against the Karluk's hull became relentless. The ice heaved. The ship screamed, a sound like a dying whale, a horrible, resonant wail of tearing oak and iron. Bartlett ordered all hands onto the ice, and they scrambled over the side, dragging sleds, tents, and crates of hardtack and pemmican. The Inuit women, Kuruluk and Kururuk, carried the small children wrapped in caribou hides. The men grabbed rifles and ammunition. They stood 100 yards away and watched the Karluk die. It was slow. The ice pushed her over onto her side. The masts snapped like twigs. The decks buckled upward. Then, with a final grinding crunch, the hull split open. The sea rushed in, freezing instantly, into jagged fountains of ice crystals. The Karluk settled into the pack, a broken, tilted carcass, her bow pointing to the sky. She was gone. They were now alone on the ice. No ship, no rescue, no hope except the one they could build with their own hands. They named the place Shipwrecked Camp. It was a small patch of relative flatness on a moving, treacherous sea of ice. They erected the tents, a few canvas shelters that flapped and cracked in the constant wind. The temperatures were so low that breath froze in mid-air, creating a fine, crystalline fog that settled on everything. The men had to take turns staying awake at night to kick the frost off the tent walls. If they didn't, the tents would freeze solid and collapse. The food situation was dire. They had salvaged perhaps a 6-week supply of pemmican, a greasy, dense mixture of dried meat and fat, and hardtack, a cracker so hard it could break teeth. Bartlett immediately put the entire crew on half rations. A half ration was about 1,200 calories a day, barely enough to keep a man alive in temperate conditions, let alone in the Arctic, where the body burns 6,000 calories just to stay warm. Hunger became a permanent state. Men licked the grease off their knives. They chewed on strips of leather. They boiled old seal bones to make a thin, greasy broth. The Inuit, who understood the land, or rather the ice, better than anyone, tried to hunt. But the seals were wary and scarce. Kuruluk managed to kill a young bearded seal in early February, and there was a feast. But it was a brief respite. The gnawing emptiness returned within days. The trail of bones. Bartlett knew they could not stay on the drift ice forever. The pack was moving westward toward the open sea between Siberia and Alaska. Eventually, in the spring, the ice would break up, and they would drown. Their only chance was to reach land, specifically Wrangel Island, a rocky, desolate speck of land about 60 miles north of Siberia. If they could reach Wrangel, they could establish a base camp, hunt game, and wait for the summer ice to open a passage to the mainland. The problem was that Wrangel Island was 100 miles away, across a chaos of shifting, unstable ice. The terrain was not flat. It was a labyrinth of pressure ridges, some of which were 40 feet high. To cross it, they would have to drag their heavily loaded sleds up and over these ridges, a back-breaking, sweat-soaked labor that would leave them drenched. And in the Arctic, sweat equals death. The moment you stop moving, that sweat freezes into a sheet of ice inside your clothes. Bartlett made a plan. He would lead a small, fast party to Wrangel Island, establish a cache of food, and then return to the main camp to guide the others. But the main camp could not stay where it was. They had to begin moving immediately. On February 19th, they struck Shipwreck Camp and started walking. The march across the ice was a waking nightmare. The dogs were weak from hunger. The sleds were heavy. The men pulled in harnesses alongside the dogs, their breath pluming in the air, their faces masked in ice from their own frozen exhalations. Every pressure ridge was an hour of chopping with axes and hauling with ropes. Men fell, men wept. Men cursed Stephenson's name until their lips cracked and bled. One day, the ice beneath them began to crack. A lead of open water, black and smoking with cold steam, opened up directly in their path. They had to wait for 12 hours as the wind shifted and the lead froze over with new ice so thin it bowed under their weight. Bartlett went first, crawling on his belly to distribute his weight. One by one they followed, their hearts pounding as they heard the ice creak and whine beneath them. On March 12th, they finally saw it, a smudge on the horizon, dark against the white. Wrangel Island. But they were still 20 miles away, and the ice between them and the island was the worst they had seen. It was a rubble field, a jumble of ice blocks the size of cars and houses, shoved together by centuries of pressure. There was no path. They would have to blast their way through with dynamite. Bartlett sent a scout ahead. The scout returned with terrible news. Between them and the island, there was a stretch of young ice over deep water. Ice so unstable that a man could fall through without warning. Bartlett decided to send the strongest hunters forward first. Himself, Bjarni the carpenter, and an Inuit man named Kataktovik. They would go light with minimal supplies and try to reach the island. The rest of the party, the weakened, the sick, the women and children, would wait on a large stable floe. The three men set out. They moved like ghosts, testing every step with a long pole. For 3 days, they edged across the young ice, sleeping in the lee of pressure ridges, eating raw seal meat that was frozen so hard it cut their mouths. On the 3rd day, they stepped onto the rocky beach of Wrangel Island. They had made it. But the island was a desert. No vegetation, no seals on the ice. Just gravel, snow, and the bones of dead polar bears. They built a small hut out of driftwood and sod. They killed a few seals. They waited for the rest of the party. Back on the floe, the waiting was killing them. The food had run out. The men were eating their dogs. First the weak dogs, then the good ones. They boiled the harnesses for glue. They chewed on the soles of their boots. The young scientist, Kenneth Martin, had grown so thin that his ribs showed through his parka. The sailor, Stanley Morris, had descended into complete catatonia. He would not speak. He would not move. He just sat in the tent staring at the wall. Then the scurvy began. Scurvy is a disease of the blood caused by a lack of vitamin C. It starts with fatigue and aching joints. Then the gums swell and bleed. Old wounds reopen. Teeth fall out. The skin becomes mottled with bruises. The mind grows foggy, irritable, paranoid. One of the men, a burly seaman named John Brady, developed a black, weeping sore on his leg that would not heal. The flesh around it began to die. By the time Bartlett returned to the main camp with a small rescue party, the camp was a charnel house. 2 men had died. Brady was delirious with infection. The Inuit child, little Helen, was coughing a wet, rattling cough. Pneumonia. Kuraluk, her father, had a look in his eyes that was no longer human. It was the look of an animal that has been cornered for too long. The law of the ice. The return journey to Rangel Island was a death march. The weak had to be carried on sleds. The dogs were almost all gone. The men took turns pulling. The ice was breaking up beneath them. Leads of open water appeared without warning. On one crossing, a sailor named Ernest Chafe fell through the ice up to his chest. They dragged him out, but his legs were already freezing solid. He could not walk. They had to leave him behind in a tent with a rifle and a promise. He shot himself. 3 days later, they reached Wrangell Island in early April. The sun was finally returning, a cold, pale disk that barely cleared the horizon, but it was light. They moved into the driftwood hut, which they called the hut. It was cramped, dark, and reeked of seal oil and human waste. But it was land, solid land. The ice around the island was beginning to melt, which meant the seals would return, which meant food. But the food did not come. The spring hunt was meager. A few scrawny seals. 1 polar bear, which they killed and ate in a single gluttonous weekend. The pemmican was gone. The hardtack was gone. They were living on seal broth and boiled leather. The Inuit women, Kuraluk and Kuraruk, were brilliant at making something out of nothing. They would scrape the hide of a seal for every scrap of fat, boil the bones until they crumbled, and sew patches of fur into mittens and boots. But even their skills had limits. The scurvy worsened. Alistair Forbes Mackay, the Antarctic veteran, was now so weak he could not stand. His teeth were loose in his gums. He wrote in his diary, in a shaky hand, "I am dying. Tell my mother I loved her." He did not die, not yet, but he came close. The horror of Wrangell Island was not just the hunger, it was the silence. And then when the silence broke, the screaming. One night, a young sailor named Robert Williamson went mad. He had been the cheerful one, the joker. But the constant pressure, the starvation, the sight of his friends rotting from the inside out, it snapped something. He began to rant in the middle of the night about a ship he saw on the horizon. He ran out of the hut onto the ice, screaming for the ship to come back. They had to tackle him and tie him to a post. He sobbed for hours, a terrible animal sound. And then there was the question of the Inuit. The scientists and the sailors had never fully accepted them as equals. Now, with food running out, the old prejudices surfaced. A rumor began to circulate in whispers. The Inuit had hidden food. They were not sharing their private caches. The whispers grew louder. One night, Bjarni the carpenter, usually a quiet, gentle man, took Bartlett aside. "Captain," he said, "if we don't find food soon, the men are going to kill the Inuit. They're going to kill them and eat them." Bartlett did not sleep that night. He knew Bjarni was right. The law of the ice, the unwritten code of the Arctic, was brutal. When starvation reaches its final stage, the distinction between man and animal blurs. He had seen it before, in stories from the Franklin expedition. He had never believed he would see it in his own command. He took action. He gathered the remaining able-bodied men, barely 5 of them, and organized a desperate final hunt. They would walk 30 miles south, to a rocky point where the currents kept the ice open, and they would hunt seals until they dropped. They took the last of the ammunition. They took a single sled. They left the hut with the sick, the dying, and the Inuit, hoping against hope that they would return before the screaming started again. The hunt was a miracle. At the southern point of Wrangel Island, they found a polynya, an area of open water that never freezes. And in that polynya, there were seals, hundreds of them. They shot and shot until their barrels were hot. They killed 20 seals in a single day. They butchered them on the ice and dragged the meat back to the hut in a bloody, triumphant procession. For the first time in months, they ate until they were full. The scurvy began to recede, the sores closed, the gums tightened. Alistair Mackay took his first steps in weeks. The madness in Williamson's eyes faded, replaced by a dull, exhausted sanity. Even little Helen's cough quieted. But they could not stay on Wrangel Island forever. The ice was melting, the pack was breaking up. Soon the island would be surrounded by open water, and they had no boat. They had salvaged a small, leaky canvas canoe from the Carluck, but it would hold maybe 3 men. They needed a real ship, and no ship was coming. Stephenson had not sent a rescue. He had told the outside world that the Carluck was fine, that the expedition was merely delayed by ice. Bartlett made a decision that was either heroic or insane. He would take the Inuit hunter Kataktovik and sailed the tiny canoe across the open sea to Siberia. It was a journey of 70 miles across the Arctic Ocean in a boat that leaked, with no compass, no navigation equipment, and a single paddle. From Siberia, he would walk to a trading post, charter a ship, and return for his crew. It was, by any rational measure, a suicide mission. But it was the only chance they had. On May 15th, 1914, Bartlett and Kataktovik pushed off from Wrangel Island into the gray, freezing sea. The water was so cold that a man would survive perhaps 3 minutes if he fell in. They paddled for 48 hours, without sleep. The canoe leaked constantly. Kataktovik bailed with a tin cup while Bartlett paddled. They navigated by the sun when they could see it, and by sheer instinct when they could not. A storm came up, and they nearly capsized. Bartlett later wrote that he looked at Kataktovik, and the Inuit man looked back at him, and they both nodded. They were going to die, but they kept paddling. On the 3rd day, they saw the coast of Siberia, a low brown line on the horizon. They paddled harder. The canoe began to fall apart. The seams opened. The water rose to their ankles. They were 500 yards from the beach when the canoe finally sank. They jumped into the water, which was just above freezing, and swam. They dragged themselves onto the gravel beach, shivering, laughing, weeping. They were alive. Bartlett walked for 6 days across the Siberian tundra, through swarms of mosquitoes and across swollen rivers, until he found a small Chukchi village. The villagers gave him tea and dried fish. He managed to send a telegram to the American consul in St. Petersburg. Carluck crushed in ice. Crew marooned on Wrangel Island. Need rescue immediately. The message was garbled. It took weeks to reach Ottawa and Washington, but finally the news broke. Stephenson's lies unraveled. The world learned that 14 men, 2 women, and 2 children had been left to die while the great explorer had been giving lectures in New York. A rescue ship, the King and Winge, was chartered. It sailed north immediately. On September 7th, 1914, Nearly a year after the Karluk had been frozen in, the King and Winge steamed into the waters off Wrangel Island. The men on the beach saw the smoke first, then the mast, then the hull. They ran to the shore shouting, waving their arms. The Inuit women cried. The children stared, not understanding. The sailors wept, openly. The rescue crew counted the survivors. Of the 25 people who had sailed on the Karluk, 14 had survived. 11 had died. They had died of starvation, of scurvy, of madness, of drowning, of murder. One man, a sailor named Michael Mickey O'Leary, had been shot by another crew member in a paranoid rage, a dark secret that would fester for decades. The bodies of the dead were left on Wrangel Island in shallow graves that the permafrost would eventually push back to the surface. Vilhjalmur Stephenson never faced a court-martial. He never went to prison. He returned to civilization, wrote a best-selling book about the friendly Arctic, and continued to lecture for decades. He died in 1962, a wealthy and respected elder of the geographical community. He never apologized. He never even acknowledged that he had done anything wrong. To the end, he maintained that he had left the Karluk on a legitimate hunting trip and that the subsequent disaster was a tragic act of God. Captain Robert Bartlett, the true hero of the story, was haunted by the experience for the rest of his life. He went on to lead other expeditions, but he never forgot the faces of the men he had to leave behind. He wrote a memoir, The Last Voyage of the Karluk, which is a masterpiece of understated horror. He died in 1946, a forgotten figure in the land that had once called him a hero. The Inuit fared worst of all. Kuruluk and Kururuk returned to Alaska, but they were outcasts. The white men had treated them as less than human, and the experience had scarred them. Kataktovik, who had paddled with Bartlett to Siberia, was given a small medal and then ignored. Within a few years, most of the Karluk Inuit had died of diseases brought by the whalers: measles, influenza, consumption. Their children, Pagni and Helen, grew up in orphanages, the last living witnesses to the worst Arctic disaster in history. The Karluk itself still lies somewhere at the bottom of the Chukchi Sea, her bones scattered across the continental shelf. Every few years a storm stirs up a piece of wreckage, a plank, a barrel hoop, a human femur, and the locals on the Siberian coast find it and wonder. They never know the full story. They never know about the screaming in the hut, the taste of boiled boot leather, the look in a man's eyes when he realizes he has been abandoned by his own leader. The Arctic does not remember. It does not judge. It simply exists, beautiful and indifferent, waiting for the next dreamer to test his hubris against its frozen heart. And somewhere out there, in the white silence, the ghosts of the Karluk still drift, still hungry, still waiting for a rescue that will never come.